And I think that we really need to speak to this implementation deficit. When I was the president of the UN General Assembly, I passed, I think, close to 400 resolutions under the umbrella of the General Assembly. My concern is what has happened since, how much implementation, how much translation into policy at the national level, how much these 400 or less, little less resolutions have transformed and improved the lives of people.
This is the Go Maluku podcast.
James, UN reform is coming up. What do you think the role of Indigenous people should be in that reform? Maybe also tagging into your experiences as special rapporteur as well as former advisor to the PGA.
Yeah, thank you. I think a predicate for the question is that the UN is in need of reform in many aspects. We talk about the need for revitalization of the UN General Assembly, the need for more efficient and streamlined processes in the treaty bodies and the Universal Periodic Review. And also we talk about the need for enhanced participation of Indigenous peoples at the UN. There's so many different dimensions of this reform issue. I think that Indigenous peoples, and I say this humbly, and as a matter of my own opinion and part as a matter of strategy, I need to prioritize enhanced participation in the United Nations system. These other aspects of reform touch upon Indigenous people's concerns, but not as, in my view, importantly as the need for Indigenous peoples to have a proper place within the UN system and not to have to fit within that category of NGO or simply individual participants or experts, these existing categories that don't adequately capture the place of Indigenous peoples in the world, Indigenous peoples' rights, their real status, and what should be their place within the United States system, this system of we the peoples that María Fernanda referred to as articulated within the UN Charter itself. Now, as recall, the outcome document of the World Conference on Indigenous Peoples, the General Assembly resolution that embodies that outcome document, it called for examining methods for enhancing participation of Indigenous peoples within the UN system, and indeed the GA authorized, the General Assembly authorized a process for examining and moving toward a system of enhanced participation. Now, I, along with my good friend and colleague Claire Charters, were named by the then President of the General Assembly as advisors in that process. And the process made some progress, I guess you could say, by providing a platform for the airing of views, concerns, but unfortunately, nothing concrete yet has come out of that process. I'm hopeful that something will. I'm hopeful that the momentum gained thus far will carry forward. But to me, this is the key reform for Indigenous peoples, because once having enhanced participation, enhanced status, then the ability to participate in the forging of the reforms in these other areas is enhanced manyfold. And so in my view and my opinion, and as partly as a matter of strategy, this should be the priority, that is enhancing participation of Indigenous peoples through an enhanced status within the United Nations system. And it's in my view, it's really it represents an incongruity within the UN system. The United Nations has acknowledged Indigenous peoples as people with rights of self-determination. As we know, through the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. We have all those documents within the UN system, the outcome document, others that reiterate this recognition in the abstract, but yet when it comes to actually operationalizing that status within the UN system itself, that hasn't happened. And so the UN itself, the UN system itself is not in compliance with its own standards. And there is a deep need for the UN to make good on its own promises.
Yeah, well, I think that basically, as always, I think that James said it all in a way. But when we look at the UN ecosystem, which is extremely complex for a regular citizen from around the world to understand how the treaty bodies operate, how the special rapporteurs work, how countries report on the universal periodic reviews on their human rights commitments, now how governments report on through the VNRs, the voluntary national reviews on progress regarding the Sustainable Development Goals and the 2030 Agenda. It is a very complex ecosystem, even more complex than the tropical rainforest ecosystem. But basically, I think that this pending homework that we have, and the pending homework is how to institutionalize a building mechanism to ensure the voice and meaningful participation of indigenous peoples in the multilateral architecture as a whole. And as James mentioned, of course, there is the permanent forum, which it's a very important platform. But basically, the Indigenous Forum is, even though it's extremely important, it's indigenous leaders and intellectuals talking to each other in a way, with very little participation and engagement from member states sometimes. That has been my experience. And in basically indigenous peoples, leaders and intellectuals and professionals talking to indigenous peoples' issues. But I think that if we are serious about this new social contract, we need this building institutional machinery, which provides indigenous peoples with a special status. When I say this, it's not that civil society and the NGO community has their participation deficit solved. It is not happening. Also, I mean, there is a big challenge. That's why the Secretary General has called for a inclusive networked multilateralism. And we cannot think about an inclusive network multilateral system if indigenous peoples do not have a voice, do not participate and engage actively. And yet again, not only to discuss about the indigenous people's agenda, which is very profuse, very diverse, very important. It varies from region to region. In some region, the issue of land rights and in land security is critical. In other parts of the world, is political participation, livelihood struggles, is the right to self-determination, is a profound legal reform on countries like, for example, there is a plurinational de facto situation, but it's not fully recognized like constitutions like the Bolivian constitution or the Ecuadorian constitution do. So basically, I think that there's a long way to go to address, in my opinion, two of the great deficits of the multilateral architecture. And one is the implementation deficit. Even though if we look at the World Conference outcome document, there is a very direct call to all the UN programs and agencies to support countries in landing the UN declaration in their own national legislations and policy decisions and planning architecture. And I don't know, and perhaps you know better, but how many countries have used the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and translated into national legislation, for example, or have used it as a planning and policy design tool? I think that they're very, very few. And I think that we really need to speak to this implementation deficit. When I was the president of the UN General Assembly, I passed, I think, close to 400 resolutions under the umbrella of the General Assembly. And my concern is what has happened since, you know, how much implementation, how much translation into policy at the national level, how much these 400 or less, little less resolutions have transformed and improved the lives of people. The phrase, the motto I use for my presidency is making the UN relevant for all. The issue of relevance, the issue of really making the multilateral work improve the quality of life, improve the rights and the human rights standards at the local level. That's what it's all about. And I think that we again need to reconnect and address seriously this implementation deficit. And the other, I said two important deficits. One is the implementation deficit, basically that comes together with accountability and monitoring and serious monitoring mechanisms. And for that, again, you know, the voice, agency, and participation of Indigenous peoples is central. And the number two, I would say it's the inclusion and participation deficit. The multilateral system is based on an intergovernmental architecture, and I think that there is no doubt. But in order to make decisions that have the legitimacy, that have the strength, the power, the social ownership, you need the participation and the voices of we the peoples. And here, I think that it speaks very much of perhaps a third deficit that just came to mind, is a trust deficit in institutions in general, worldwide. And I was in shock, you know, a few weeks ago when I looked at the Latino Barometro. No? It's a mechanism to measure confidence of society in public institutions. And Latino Barometro, basically, I think it is the confluence of inequalities, exclusion, concentration of political power, poor economic performance, basically has pushed, you know, to increase this trust deficit, and the numbers are scary. Basically, the numbers say that in Latin America and the Caribbean, 81% of the population considers that income distribution is unfair. 77% considers that our societies in the region are governed in the interest of a few wealthy and not for the good for all. 80% consider that access to justice is biased, and 60% say that access to education is unequal. And to add to that, 80% of the population do not believe in political parties in their political systems. And I think it's something that we need to ask ourselves. How is that we can counter this trust deficit in democratic institutions, in politics? And I think that the role the multilateral system, the United Nations, delivering for the people in need is extremely important. And for that, we need to redesign, refresh, retool, modernize the United Nations. And I think that we have so much expectations of the upcoming report from the Secretary General called Our Common Agenda. And this report was mandated by the UN 75th political declaration, the 75th anniversary of the United Nations, now the 76th anniversary. I think the time is ripe to rethink, the institutional structures. 76 years have passed. The current geopolitics, the current world, the processes of decolonization, everything has changed. When the charter was first signed, we had 51 countries, subscribing the UN Charter and being part of this new League of Nations. Today, we have 193 countries, a geopolitical landscape that is so different, in a social energy, vitality that is so much needed as we think the new multilateralism, what I call multilateralism 2.0. And the new retooled multilateral system cannot be without the voices and the agency of Indigenous peoples, with a proper built-in, institutionalized inclusion and participation machinery. And we still have this pending homework. During my presidency, and I think 2 or 3 times we have had these interactive dialogues, these conversations to discuss on the participation modalities. But now I think we have enough elements to have already with a piece that can be discussed and agreed upon. It is so much needed if we really want an inclusive and networked multilateralism, as the Secretary General has called for. Back to you, Ghazali.
My friends, I hope you enjoyed this. Please consider to subscribe, to comment, and to share this video on your socials.